is my father, etc. Well, this one simply means Horus is my father. So that is what Hiram Abiff means. Horus is my father.
Fascinating, and it makes sense, a lot of sense too.
Yeah. So we can actually find out real things about these people at last.
Yeah.
And this idea that Hiram Abiff came from Tyre, because it says he came from Tyre, and every Mason will say, oh, he was an architect who came from Tyre. Tyre is the city on the Mediterranean coast, up by Byblos.
Sure.
In modern Lebanon. It's in Lebanon, isn't it? Yeah. And they say, oh, well, he came from Tyre. How could he come from Egypt? You're wrong. Well, he didn't come from Tyre. If you look at the Hebrew, Tyre simply means stone. So where would an architect come from? The stone quarries.
Of course, yeah, sure.
So he was Hiram Abiff from the stone quarries. Of course, where did we find this name? Because this list of architects doesn't occur in the temples of Egypt. The only place that is actually scribbled is in the quarry, because that's where they work. So this name is actually scribbled as a big list of architects who worked for the various pharaohs. And, in the middle of this list, we have Hiram Abiff, who was the architect of Pasiba Kahayunet.
Fascinating.
And Tyre, which means the quarry.
Fascinating.
Once you know what the Bible is talking about, suddenly you can say, hold on a minute, this is real history.
Sure.
And I can understand it.
Yeah.
And it's not nonsense anymore. It's like that conversation we were having about Joseph coming down into Egypt.
Sure.
When you first read it, it reads as absolute nonsense. But when you understand it, suddenly it makes sense. I know what it means. You don't even have to change any of the words. You just have to change the understanding of those words.
Yeah. And I guess
suddenly we start getting real history.
Absolutely. And I guess here also your I guess study into etymology becomes very important also.
It becomes very important because, yes, you hang on a word. And as I've started translating the Bible, you find that the translators have used some pretty dubious translations. Because you go from the Hebrew. Remember, Hebrew was lost as a living language. And it had to be reconstructed. And so they're not always quite sure the exact precise meanings. And even if they are sure of the precise meanings of these words, there are often 2 or 3 choices. And you only need to make the wrong choice, and you've suddenly changed the whole layout of that particular sentence, that particular paragraph. The meaning of that entire chapter has been changed just because you've chosen the wrong translation. And if you choose the obvious translation, it might actually go against your theology, but it makes a lot more sense. And so this is what the project that still needs to be done. The Bible needs to be retranslated back into what makes sense, as opposed to what makes sense theologically speaking.
Yeah.
So on numerous occasions they have chosen the wrong translation. I'm pretty sure of that.
This is again fascinating.
But just moving on from the discovery of King David. So yes. From this, of course, we can identify who these people are. And, of course, we can identify their city, which was Tanis in Egypt. And, of course, one of the major discoveries in Egypt, which didn't receive any media space in the newspapers at all, was the discovery of the tombs of the Tanis kings. And the reason it didn't get in the newspapers was because it happened on pretty much the same time as the Second World War broke out. So obviously other people were more concerned about the war than the discovery in Egypt.
Sure.
This particular tomb was as rich as the tomb of Tutankhamun. It's a fascinating display. So if you happen to be in Egypt, make sure you go to see the Tanis display, because it's stuck in a room and nobody goes in there. It was in total darkness when I went in there the first time. And it's only down the corridor from the Tutankhamun exhibition. And there's thousands of people milling around Tutankhamun. And just down the corridor there is an equally fantastic display with nobody there at all. I sat there for about 3 hours trying to get photographs, and about 5 people wandered in. And the most marvelous display of gold and silver work, absolutely fantastic. And these are the sarcophagi of King David and King Solomon. So there's a lot of history behind these particular artifacts as well. And most marvelous still is there was each of these pharaohs had a death mask made.
Mm-hmm.
And the death mask of King Solomon, that was obviously the son of King David, is absolutely marvelous. So you can actually see precisely how this person looked as well, because it's a very lifelike gold death mask. So yes, if anyone happens to be in the Egyptian Museum, I do recommend that display.
Fascinating.
But this also gives us a method of finding King Solomon's mines, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
So here we have the legendary King Solomon's mines, which people have written about and searched for decades, for centuries. An enduring myth that King Solomon had hugely wealthy, rich gold mines, which funded his kingdom. And he did. And this is where history starts to help us. Now, people have gone looking for these mines over Nubia and down south, even down into the south of Africa. But you don't have to go that far. Now, the history of these particular pharaohs of Lower Egypt, Susens, and his descendants, were that they were in conflict. Yet again, Egypt was divided, of course. And so you had a pharaoh in the north, and not quite a pharaoh, but you certainly had priest kings down in the south, and Egypt was divided. Now, the northern pharaohs started to get the upper hand, and it's quite obvious from the historical record of Thebes that Thebes was having to give tribute to the northern kings to stop them attacking. And this tribute took the form of gold, obviously, and precious objects. But they started to run out of gold and precious objects. So what the Tanis kings, what the Upper Egyptian kings, the southern kings, started to do was to raid the tombs of the pharaohs. Because at about this exact same of time, we get this history of the Valley of the Kings being raided by tomb robbers. Now, I've never quite understood this, because everyone says, oh, these tomb robbers just started robbing. Well, I'm sorry, but the Valley of the Kings was a sealed-off area. You don't just get, and it's a single valley. It's easy to police. You just put people on the bottom.
Yeah, sure.
And one or two people wandering up the valley every now and then, make sure no one comes over the top. It's not hard to police it. So how did these tomb robbers get into these tombs and not only rob them, but rob them of very large items? I mean, they were taking sarcophagi out. I mean, these things weighed tons.
Yeah.
And it's not something you can do overnight with, a couple of people and a rope. This was state-sponsored pillage. This was not tomb robbers. And it's quite obvious from the history of this era that there was this conflict between North and South yet again, that the southern pharaohs were actually organizing this pillage of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings in order to pay tribute to the northern kings, to the northern pharaohs. And the northern pharaohs happened to be Pasiba Kahainit and Shoshenq, the kings of Tanis, the 21st and 22nd dynasty. So these were King Solomon's mines. King Solomon's mines were not a natural gold mine. It was mines in the plural. They were man-made mines. They were the Valley of the Kings and the tombs of the 18th dynasty kings. these were King Solomon's mines, and this is where he was getting his gold from. And we know he was getting artifacts from these tombs because we found them in the Tanis tombs. So this is the history of King Solomon's mines. They were raiding the 18th dynasty tombs in the Valley of the Kings in order to pay tribute. So there is a real history behind this mythology. But one can imagine why it was kept a little bit secret, because it eventually resulted in the destruction of all of that material. Very little of it now remains. You know, some of it was found in the tombs of the Tanis kings, but I dare say a lot of it was melted down. Because, for instance, Shoshenq had a sarcophagus that was made of solid silver.
Oh.
And silver, of course, was more expensive than gold. It was either harder to find or harder to work, but it was valued at a greater price than gold was. And yet he managed to get, in fact, both kings, Susen's and Shoshenq, both had solid silver sarcophagi.
Oh my.
Quite fantastic for
yeah. So, do you think if there were some, you know, archaeological digs and so forth around Tanis, that we actually could discover a real Solomon's temple, something like that?
Yes, well, there are 2 temples presently uncovered. Not a lot of archaeology has been done on Tanis. I mean, they've uncovered 2 of the temples. But in terms of a systematic survey and archaeology of the whole region, that has not been done. And I'm sure if they did do it, and they did it with an open mind, rather than a closed mind at present, because of course you cannot work on these areas without the permission of the Egyptian authorities, of course.
Sure.
And they will not work on any area that may produce results that link the Egyptians with the Jews. It gets very political. So they will not allow open archaeology on these areas. But I'm sure if they did, they would find evidence that points towards King Solomon and King David, because this is where they lived.
Yeah, fascinating. So they're a very, you know, highly, you know, possible place to look for, you know, people who are interested and so forth. And of course, as you say, it all depends on you know, where the official historians down there actually want to go with all this.